Lecture 82, Albert Camus.
On the day when the death toll reached 30, Dr. Rieu read an official telegram that the prefect had just handed him, remarking, "So they've got alarmed at last." The telegram ran, "Proclaim a state of plague. Stop. Close the town." So ends part one of The Plague, Albert Camus' novel about a plague that ravages the Algerian city of Oran for a period of 10 months, sometime in the 1940s. In the middle of April, just as spring brings the heady fragrance of roses to the very center of this Mediterranean port, it is suddenly invaded by thousands of rats that have evidently come from one or more of the ships docked just outside it. Infected by a fatal disease, the rats soon die, but not before transmitting a highly contagious bacillus that strikes human beings with buboes, inflamed swellings of the lymphatic glands. Aided and abetted by chills, fever, and vomiting, buboes typically kill anyone they strike. By the end of part one of this novel, the young Dr. Bernard Rieu knows just how deadly they can be, because their first victim lives right in his apartment building. Soon after discovering and collecting several dead rats in the hall, the concierge sprouts abscesses, starts vomiting, runs a fever, and dies, with the doctor looking helplessly on. His death sounds the first alarm in the doctor's mind. When 20 more cases of the same type shortly kill almost 20 more people, he dares to give this epidemic a name. "It's hardly credible," he says to another doctor, "but everything points to its being plague." Incredibly enough, it is bubonic plague, which most of us consider a medieval disease long banished by medical science from the developed world. Most officials of Oran think likewise. In the middle of the 20th century, Algeria is still a French colony inhabited by people who can scarcely believe that such a thing as pestilence can descend upon them. They are humanists, we are told, which in this novel means people who think the world revolves around human beings and is rationally organized to serve them as they go about their business. Since pestilence can hardly serve them, they consider it a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But Dr. Rieu insists that this new disease could kill off half the town in 2 months, half of 200,000 people. When reliable statistics shortly bear him out, the city prefect asks him to draft a report for the government of the whole colony, the governor answers it with a tersely worded telegram: "Declare a plague and close the town." In other words, close the town gates and post sentries at them so that no one can leave. Thus quarantined at the very outbreak of spring, and all its fresh roses, the whole town suddenly becomes a gigantic funeral parlor or a giant prison from which no one can be sure of ever getting out alive. In 1941, when Albert Camus started writing The Plague, he was getting to know the city of Oran firsthand. Having first seen it in 1939, he returned 2 years later with his new wife, Francine Farret, a native of the city whom he had met in Algiers. In Oran, he taught at a private school where he must surely have captivated his students quite as much as he would later captivate his readers, for this was no ordinary teacher. By the age of 27, he was already well on his way to becoming one of the most remarkable writers of his time. He began his life in the inland Algerian village of Mondovi, where he was born in November 1913, just a few months before the outbreak of World War I. His father was a winery worker of French extraction. His mother, whose grandparents had come from the Spanish island of Majorca, was illiterate. Less than a year after his birth, his father died of wounds suffered in the First Battle of the Marne. By then, Albert and his older brother Lucien had moved with their mother to Algiers, where she worked as a cleaning woman and where all three of them lived with her own mother and her two brothers in a 3-room apartment with no electricity, no running water, not a single book, and just one toilet shared with 2 other apartments. Could any seedbed for a life in literature sound less promising? How could this second son of a widowed, illiterate cleaning woman ever find his way out of poverty, let alone into print? apart from the ultimately unfathomable mysteries of genetics, the answer, or at least part of the answer, lies with a teacher at the primary school that Camus attended up to the age of 10. Recognizing the boy's potential, the teacher gave him special instruction and helped him to win a scholarship to secondary school. No teacher's investment in a promising child was ever more handsomely rewarded. In 1957, when Albert Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he dedicated his acceptance speech to the grade school teacher he never forgot, Louis Germain. At about the age of 17, Camus entered the University of Algiers, where he studied philosophy while supporting himself with odd jobs and loans. By age 23, when he completed his diploma thesis on the relation between Christianity and Greek philosophy, he had already begun to display an astonishing variety of talents and interests. In spite of tuberculosis, which first struck him when he was 16 and stalked him for the rest of his life, he poured his creative energy into journalism, drama, literature, and politics. For a time, politics drove him almost as much as literature did. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the 20-year-old Camus took his stand against fascism by joining the Communist Party to spread its gospel among the Muslims of Algeria. 2 years later, he co-founded a theater company in Algiers that sought to raise money for unemployed workers, even as it mounted plays such as Maxime Gorky's Lower Depths. With Camus' help, the company also created a play of its own, Revolt in the Asturias, inspired by a miners' strike in 1934 that had been brutally suppressed by the far right-wing government of Spain. By his mid-20s, Camus was leading several lives at once. Having loved to perform ever since primary school, he toured Algeria as an actor for Radio Algiers. At the same time, he was starting to write for a liberal newspaper, Alger Républicain, lecturing on Mediterranean culture and getting himself kicked out of the Communist Party for stirring up Muslims against colonialism. He was also working on his first novel, The Happy Death. That was never published, but it led the way to his second novel, The Stranger, which appeared in print when he was 28. But he never did just one thing at a time. While writing The Stranger and seeing it into print, he wrote a play called Caligula, published a book of essays, founded a literary review, helped to produce nearly 400 issues of the Alger Républicain, moved to Paris to work for the newspaper Paris Soir, left Paris when the Germans occupied it in the summer of 1940, married the lovely Francine Fauré, settled down with her in Oran, and started work on The Plague. Imagine having that for a teacher. During all this time, he was also devouring the work of writers and philosophers ranging from Marcus Aurelius to Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Melville, and Tolstoy. Camus was one of the most philosophical novelists who ever lived. Reviewing a novel by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1938, when he was working on The Stranger, Camus wrote, "A novel is never anything but a philosophy expressed in images." So long as we construe this grand generalization as a particular statement about novels by Sartre and Camus himself, it makes perfect sense. In reviewing The Stranger, Sartre argued that the key to its meaning lies in the philosophic essay that Camus wrote in tandem with it, and that was published just a few months after it in 1942, namely The Myth of Sisyphus. Let's briefly glance at Sisyphus and The Stranger before returning to The Plague. If the novel for Camus is a philosophy couched in images, The Myth of Sisyphus presents what might be called an image of Camus' philosophy. For this philosophic essay revolves around the image of an ancient Greek king who was punished for defying the gods. They condemned him forever to pushing a rock up a mountain, letting it fall back down, and pushing it up again. So for Camus, Sisyphus exemplifies absurdity in the sense of profound irrationality, exasperating futility, head-splitting frustration. This kind of absurdity often turns up in modern literature. It permeates Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, as we will see, where two old tramps spend each day waiting for their evening appointment with a figure who never appears. But the absurdity of Sisyphus is even more vexing because he stands all alone against the rock, and because he's not just waiting, but rather pushing, straining, heaving to no purpose at all. His whole being, writes Camus, is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. In the myth of Sisyphus, then, Camus asks the fundamental question, what he calls the only truly serious philosophic question, whether life is worth living. This question calls to mind French existentialism, more precisely the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. Building on Martin Heidegger's contention that to be is simply to be thrown into the world we live in, Sartre argued that we have no essence, merely existence. Unlike Aristotle and Aquinas, who taught that human beings are stamped by nature with the essence of humanity, Sartre claimed that man is totally free, wholly responsible for his fate, absolutely unbound by any predetermined nature or ultimate design. But unlike Sartre and the other French existentialists, whom he never completely agreed with, Camus struggled to explain the purpose of life by answering this scary question. If we can no longer put our faith and trust in eternal values and the wisdom of God, why should we not commit suicide? Camus' answer, in its simplest form, is that a lifetime of struggle must be its own reward. Having defied the gods, he writes, Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus thus turns the myth of Sisyphus into a fascinating paradox. An eternity of striving in the face of futility somehow breeds happiness and satisfaction. If you find it hard to grasp this paradox, and I must say I find it very hard to grasp it myself, you will find it harder still to grasp the purpose and meaning of Camus' novel, The Stranger. Set largely in Algiers, The Stranger is the first-person story of a man named Moursault, a middle-aged office worker who for no compelling reason kills another man and is then condemned to the guillotine. He's condemned not simply for the murder, but for the crime of heartlessness. In refusing to mourn the death of his mother, in taking a mistress and seeing a comic film right after overseeing the burial of his mother, he estranges himself from conventional human society, which runs by the dictates of sentiment. Disgusted by the murderer's refusal to express any regret for his crime, the prosecutor likewise deplores his filial insensitivity. A man who is morally guilty of his mother's death, says the prosecutor, is no more fit for human society than a parasite is. Besides breaking the rules of sentiment, Moursault has absolutely no faith in any higher values, no faith in miracles on earth or salvation in heaven. Accepting the inevitability of his death, systematically steeling his mind against every possible hope of a reprieve, he likewise spurns the solaces of religion, calmly telling the priest who comes to see him that he does not believe in God. In the end, emptied of hope, Moursault opens his heart only to the benign indifference of the universe, the brother of his own indifference. He's happy only in the sense that Sisyphus is happy, contented with his own unflinching resolution to face the futility of hope. Camus' The Stranger is an ordeal of purgation. Narrated by a murderer who seems to have purged himself of every possible sentiment, it tests our own capacity to imagine a universe that may be ultimately indifferent to us, a universe without hope, a life with no promise of an afterlife. It was not hard to imagine such a universe in the 1940s. For even as Camus was completing The Stranger, the outbreak of a second great war gave him fresh cause to doubt the existence of good, let alone the existence of God. Scarcely 20 years after slaughtering more than 8.5 million men, how could the nations of Europe possibly wish to kill even more? Could a single novelist do anything to stop the plague of war, or at the very least keep it from spreading or coming back again? In the summer of 1941, when much of Europe was already plagued by German troops, something like this question must have prompted Camus to start working on La Peste, his novel of The Plague. Writing this novel in time of war, he takes as his subject a long-established metaphor for war. But in Camus' hands, this metaphor turns into something much more powerful, a symbol of war. Metaphor and symbol are not easy terms to distinguish. Both combine an image with an idea. Both use something we can visualize to help us understand something that is abstract or vague. War is a plague, love is a roller coaster ride, marriage is a roll of the dice. Those are all metaphors. Each gives us a fleeting image of an abstract idea, a way of seeing it. But none of these images demands to be seen in its own right. Each of them works like a lens. We don't look at it, we look through it to see something else. By contrast, a symbol works like a gem. It demands to be looked at for its own sake. Whatever a finely cut diamond may symbolize, whether love or security, it first of all catches the eye. Whatever a symbol leads us to think about or imagine, it first demands that we examine it closely on its own terms. A symbol makes perfect sense on those terms. Whatever else it signifies or symbolizes, the plague in Camus' novel is no mere lens. It's a relentlessly murderous force that is thoroughly, patiently, and dispassionately scrutinized. As such, of course, it can symbolize war. It can forcefully represent certain aspects of war. It can remind us of war. Early on in Camus' novel, just after Dr. Rieux first suspects that a plague may have struck the city of Oran, the narrator openly compares plagues to wars. Both, he writes, take us equally by surprise, and both commonly last longer than we expect them to. The Second World War surely displayed both features. Few people saw it coming, and few foresaw that it would last 6 years. But Camus' novel never refers directly to the Second World War. It simply tells the story of a plague in such a way as to remind us of that war and make us see certain features of all war in stark relief. We may never know exactly what the first readers of this novel felt when it appeared in June of 1947, barely 2 years after the war ended in Europe. But we surely know that in the 21st century, war is still with us, and terrorism spreads like a plague across the globe. In Camus' novel, plague and war between them raise a daunting barrier against hope. Whether we take the plague of this novel just for itself or as a symbol of war, it conjures up a universe that seems not just indifferent to humankind, but actually malevolent, or at the very least wantonly destructive. So the great question posed by the plague is simply this: what can human beings do to stop it? Are they simply condemned, like Sisyphus, to exercises in futility? The novel's answer to this question is as complicated as life itself. In the city of Oran, the first major step the authorities take against the plague seems only to aggravate the misery that it brings. In closing the gates of the city, they turn all of its inhabitants into prisoners or exiles, cut off suddenly from everyone they know who happened to be outside the city when the gates were closed. Furthermore, lest infection travel by paper, the inhabitants are forbidden to send letters out, only brief telegrams. Thus, they are not only trapped in a plague-stricken city, indefinitely exposed to the danger of infection and death, but they are denied virtually all communication with those whom they love. By telling in detail what the inhabitants of the city did, thought, and felt during the 10 months of the plague, the novel itself opens the floodgates of communication to the reader. But it doesn't give us a flood of anguish. Its narrator is not even named until the last chapter of the book, where we learn that he is Bernard Rieux, the doctor who first pressed the authorities to declare a plague. Referring to himself in the third person for nearly all of the book, the narrator strives to achieve a tone of objectivity, a stance of detachment, a sense of dispassionate calm. In the very first sentence of the book, he calls his narrative a chronicle of unusual events. It is, of course, not a chronicle, but a novel, with invented features such as the gates of Oran, which in actuality has none at all. The gates signify containment, which is both physical and emotional. Like the gates, the detached tone of the narrative works to confine and control the horror of this unusual story, to anesthetize the reader against its pain. Yet, like the gates, again, the narrator's detachment seems only to intensify the pain, to make us feel it more deeply. This is partly because the narrator soon makes us know that he speaks from inside the city, as one of those who witnessed the plague firsthand, felt the misery that it caused, and faced for months its mortal danger. He speaks anonymously, but in the first person plural. Once the gates were shut, he writes, every one of us realized that all, the narrator included, were, so to speak, in the same boat, and each would have to adapt to the new conditions of life. Thus, for example, a feeling normally as individual as the ache of separation from those one loves suddenly became a feeling in which all shared alike, and, together with fear, the greatest affliction of the long period of exile that lay ahead. This remarkable passage prompts us to rethink one of the most basic tenets of modernism. Exemplified by figures such as Kafka's Joseph K. and Virginia Woolf's Septimus Smith, modernism, as we have seen, spotlights the desperation of the isolated self, the self cut off, not only from all traditional values and beliefs, but also from the solaces of a community, from love, friendship, and sympathy. Joseph K. and Septimus Smith are lonely men. Likewise, in The Stranger, Meursault is estranged from everyone else. When his mistress asks him if he loves her, he answers that her question means nothing to him, or next to nothing. But in the plague, all the inhabitants of Oran share a common fate: fear of imminent death, complete separation from those outside the city whom they love, and complete ignorance of when the plague will end. So this version of modernism, this novel, gives ample scope to the plight of individual human beings, but also shows how their common fate draws them together. Confronted by a merciless, implacable, and deadly foe, they know at least that they do not face it alone. Purged of sentiment and illusion, they forge a bond of unflinching endurance. Sooner or later, most of the characters we meet in this novel risk their lives to take their stand against the plague in some way, if only by literally taking a place beside its victims. One character reaches this point only after doing everything possible to avoid it. For a long time, a Parisian journalist named Raymond Rambert cannot understand why he should be made to stay in this plague-stricken city. Sent to Oran to write about the Arabs there, he is caught inside when the gates are closed. Sullen, aggrieved, and desperate to return to Paris and the woman he loves, he thinks only of his own case, begging the doctor to give him a certificate of good health so that he can leave the city. When the doctor says that no one may leave, the journalist charges him with heartlessness, of living in a world of abstractions. Damn it, doctor, he says. Can't you see that it's a matter of common human feeling? Or don't you realize what this sort of separation means to people who are fond of each other? Rambert does not know what we know by now, which is that Dr. Rieu himself is indefinitely separated by the plague from his own wife, who is off at a sanatorium in the mountains being treated for some unspecified illness. The doctor does not live in a world of abstractions. He lives with the private pain of separation. He works with plague victims dying at the rate of 500 a week. It is precisely the doctor's common human feeling for all those threatened by the plague that compels him to insist that no one, absolutely no one, may leave. It's an absurd situation, he says to the journalist, but we're all involved in it, and we've got to accept it as it is. Caught in an absurd situation and seeing it clearly as such, Dr. Rieu struggles against it, as if he were deliberately reenacting the myth of Sisyphus. One of the most startling things about this novel is that its hero and narrator is a doctor battling a plague, yet we almost never see him actually saving the life of a patient. Instead of the great scene of recovery that we might expect to find in such a novel, the failing patient snatched from the jaws of death, the overwhelming joy of recovery, instead of all that, we get a scene of devastating loss. When the little son of the magistrate catches the plague, Dr. Rieu decides to test a new serum on him. But under the eyes of the doctor and of a Jesuit priest named Panelou, The serum simply prolongs the boy's agony. After fighting with all his little might against the disease, the boy screams for what seems forever, sobs, and then dies, tortured to death. Afterwards, the priest tries to explain the child's death as the will of a God whose wisdom passes human understanding. In a widely noted sermon, this same priest has already argued that God has sent the plague to punish the people of Oran for what he calls their criminal indifference to God's love. When the doctor now fiercely insists on the innocence of the dead child, the priest suggests, we should love what we cannot understand. The doctor cannot agree. He cannot love a God who would torture children to death. Disbelieving in both God and salvation, he struggles only to save lives by fighting disease and thereby making life on earth a little better for those around him. Sometimes he succeeds. To his amazement, the serum that failed to save the little boy revives an old man named Grand, and soon afterwards, several other victims of the plague survive it. But the doctor takes these occasional successes just as calmly as he takes the steady drumbeat of defeat. Whatever the odds against him, the doctor quietly perseveres. Far more by example than by precept, the lesson he teaches to others is that they must endure the plague as long as it lasts and never cease to renew their struggle against it, no matter how often their hopes are cruelly disappointed. Rambert learns this lesson at last. Having tried again and again to get himself smuggled out of Oran, having pushed the stone of his hope up one hill of scheming after another, he finally decides to stay and help the doctor. In so doing, he repudiates precisely the kind of thinking that typifies Camus' own Meursault. Until now, he tells the doctor, I always felt a stranger in this town, and that I'd no concern with you people. But now that I've seen what I have seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want it or not. This business is everybody's business. Given Rambert's willingness to take his place at last in the fight against the plague, we might be tempted to see the hand of Providence in his survival and reunion with the woman he loves. But if Providence in this novel works through disease, its hand becomes a wanton fist. The plague strikes down the magistrate, father of the little boy, who has humbly gone to work in the camp where relatives of plague victims are quarantined. The plague kills the doctor's friend, Theroux, who has fought the epidemic as a way of fighting the moral plague of murderous hatred that he finds in humankind at large. And in the end, when the city is reopened and long-separated lovers joyously fly to each other's arms, what is the doctor's reward for all his labor and devotion? He learns that his wife, though safely removed from the plague-stricken city, has died of her illness. So the doctor cannot simply rejoice at the ending of the plague. Even if his wife had come back to him, he knows that no victory over a plague can ever be permanent. Though dormant for years and years, its deadly bacillus may rise again just like the lust for war. That is the truth we must face at the end of this extraordinary book. But it is not the only truth. As the doctor says at the end, this tale records what had to be done and what must be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts. If these words seem uncannily prophetic, we should closely consider what follows them, where the doctor tells us who should wage the war against terror. Despite their personal afflictions, he says, it must be waged by all who, while unable to be saints, but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. Strive their utmost to be healers. Near the end of Waiting for Godot, Didi says to Gogo, we are not saints, but we have kept our appointment. Camus' narrator could say the same, and then some. Striving to heal in a time of plague, facing death and personal affliction, he has kept his appointment with all who came to him for help, whether or not he could cure them. The doctor stands for the novel itself. Written during the Second World War and published soon thereafter, this novel strives to heal by showing how a common affliction can lead us to work together, struggle together, and recognize all that we share. As Camus said of his generation in accepting the Nobel Prize, "We found it necessary to create an art by which to live through a time of catastrophe, to be born a second time, and struggle onward, eyes open, against the instinct of death at work in our history." Camus fought death and catastrophe with a vision of rebirth. Inspired by the myth of Sisyphus, his work transcends that myth by raising his vision to a peak from which I do not believe that it will ever fall.